Good evenings and salutations, It is I, Wolfphototech, and here we are with another delightful video. This time, we're covering Xanathar's Guide to Everything, which is not quite everything, because this is not that thick of a book, but it's still thicker than the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, which happens to be thicker than any one of the three books from Spelljammer 5th edition, as we know it so far. So let's start out with, this is what I call Dungeons & Dragons. This is the beginning of Dungeons & Dragons 5.1. Okay? This is like the first point. This is the first uptick or build up in a character options that improve upon previous books and actually starts the stage of power creep in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So here we go. First and foremost, right here we happen to have the artwork for the cover I happen to have, as well as the limited alternate cover. And then we happen to have a little section right here on the contents. We have the introduction, character options, which is actually quite extensive, Dungeon Master's tools, spells, a very little section, but has a bunch of pages, and then character names for the here. And then we happen to have this nice little section right here. This whole section covers basically how to use this book, and also some little bits advice for running your games more efficiently. This is fairly useful for both players and dungeon masters, as little quick reminders. And then here we go into the character options. First and foremost, we happen to have the first set of pages for the Barbarian, which is actually a fairly nice selection. This is the first solid upgrades to the Barbarian, all the classes right here. And all these subclasses for the main classes are actually pretty good overall. We went from the Barbarian, now we're in the Bard section. And here we go. We just keep going through. And then to the Cleric. Please note that some of these classes are reprints from the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, and minor tweaks to them, but that's about it. And then you happen to have some tables for the various clerics. Some of the strongest clerics early on in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition can be found in this book. So there you go. And other classes as well. You got the section on the druid. Yet again, all these Circle of the Shepherd, Circle of Dreams. I should actually back up and list out all the subclasses. But we happen to have, for the class subclasses, Path of Ancestral Guardian for Barbarian, Path of the Storm Herald for Barbarian, Path of the Zealot for the Barbarian. I love the Path of the Zealot. I actually had a rather noteworthy character by the name of Ark, who was quite zealous, yes indeed. We have Bards, College of Glamour, College of Swords, and College of Whispers. And for the Cleric, we have Forge Domain, which is actually one of the stronger early ones, but still pretty darn good. Grave Domain, Circle of which is, we only have 2 subclasses for Clerics, and then we only have 2 subclasses for our Druids, Circle of Dreams and Circle of the Shepherd, which are pretty good. Then we have 3 subclasses for Fighter, Arcane Archer, Cavalier, and Samurai. Cavalier is probably the best one of the bunch. And then we have 3 subclasses for the Monk, Way of the Drunkard, which is decent, Way of the Kensai, which is also decent, but is actually, since Tasha's Cauldron of Everything came out, and has a bunch of options in there for monks, it actually has diminished the value of the Way of the Kensei by quite a bit. by adding in a bunch of options. So keep that in mind. Unless you want to just screw around with that kind of thing, it's good. And then you have the Way of the Sun Soul, which is actually a pretty darn good subclass for the monk. You get some decent range on your melee attacks, and you just keep pounding away. Then we go on to Paladin. You get two really good ones in here. Oath of Conquest and Oath of Redemption. Oath of Conquest is a really good build on top of the melee Paladin. But Oath of Redemption actually makes the Paladin a better spellcaster overall, with the combination of spells it gains and some features added in. Then we have Ranger, which has Gloomstalker, which is one of the strongest Rangers there is. If you happen to be traveling between planes, everything else, we got Horizon Walker, which is actually a really good one for a multiplanar adventure Paladin. A multiplanar adventure Ranger. And we have Monster Slayer, which is essentially an upgrade to the core rule, the player's handbook, Monster Hunter, or the Hunter Ranger. Then we have the Rogue. We have the Inquisitive, the Mastermind, and the Scout, and the Swashbuckler. I think the Inquisitive and the Mastermind were originally in Sword Coast Adventures Guide. And their reprints here, they're actually pretty decent. Inquisitive is basically a detective, which is good for detective adventures, as well as Mastermind. They're both okay. Scout is more nature-oriented rogue. And Swashbuckler is also pretty decent as well. You don't see them too often because they're not the strongest rogues. So there you go. You got Sorcerer, which is Divine Soul, Shadow Magic, and Storm Sorcery. Storm Sorcery is actually quite good to as a Sorcerer subclass, as well as Divine Soul, which is one of the strongest ones. And Shadow Magic is pretty decent. Then you have Warlock, which has Celestial and Hexblade. Hexblade is one of the top tier ones. Celestial is decent. Then you have War Magic, or War Mage, which is an okay but really defensive wizard. So there you go. Yet again, you have some really nice tables here for randomizing, say like, I do not know what musical instrument I want to play. Here's a random table for that. Keepsake table, secrets table, temples table. For clerics, I have to back up and go back through that again. And then I have to jump through to druids. And you actually have a nice little CR tables for common beasts by environment, which is actually a really nice add-on. Got a section on learning beast shapes, which is actually handy for druid players to read through. Hill, swamp, mountain, underdark, underwater, and then we get to the fighter, and you get Hildrick. You get a little more tables for randomizing some more features on your character. And then we get right into Arcane Archer, which is an okay archer option for fighter. A lot of people thought it was way better than Ranger early on, but it actually turns out that it's actually kind of just like putting a crappy version of Ranger with magic into fighter. Because the magic arrow options kind of just run out pretty quickly. And then you have Cavalier, which is the star of the show here. If you're decent at building characters, Cavalier can be really ridiculously overpowered. They have built-in Sentinel, and they got also built-in Mounted Combatant as well. So they stack up pretty meanly with just a few long pole weapons and stuff like that. Then we go into the Monk. We happen to have from right to left, or left to right, is the Drunken Master, the Kensai, and Sun Soul. Sun Soul is the top dog in this book. Kensai is diminished by quite a bit due to Tasha's. So you don't really want to bother with the Kensai unless you want to specifically goof around and try to go with the archer option. I mean, like, you literally want to play an archer as a monk. Kensai is like your option right there. But there's options in Tasha's that also supplant or incorporate a lot of the Kensai features into base monks. So there you go. And then you have Drunk Master, which actually has some really nice features for getting into the middle of large groups and just hitting multiple enemies. However, considering the die size of monks and the fact that they suffer from MAD, and they're a tri-primary class, is just, you have to roll really well and really want to play a Drunken Master and hope that you get far or to really unlock the potential of it. Then we have Paladins. You happen to have a nice section on randomized tables like personal goals, symbols, your nemesis, temptation, stuff like that. Stuff like that. Then we have Conquest, which is actually a good alternate for Vengeance. So, and also a great buddy for Vengeance too. If you got two Paladins in the party, you got a Vengeance Paladin and a Conquest Paladin. That is a pretty mean combination right there. And then you have Redemption Paladins, which, as I said before earlier on, actually become strong, pretty decent options for spellcasters as far as Paladins are concerned, because they have a nice mixture of spells that are added in, and they're good control Paladins. And then we have Rogues, Rangers, not Rogues. We have the Horizon Walker, the Monster Slayer, and the Gloomstalker. The Gloomstalker is like the top king of this group right here. It's actually still completely relevant to this day. You can make broken builds that can do tons and tons of damage. The Monster Slayer is also really good as well, and so is the Horizon Walker. But the Monster Slayer and the Horizon Walker are more specific to types of campaigns, which is the common problem with Rangers, is that a Ranger really is a class that jives best when made to fit a campaign. And if the campaign just happens to not align with the Ranger is diminished quickly. A lot of other, it's kind of like the Barbarian in a investigation adventure. Yeah, you can have some fun playing a really dumb barbarian in an investigation adventure, but it's you're gonna have some difficulties because you don't have the skills. The Ranger by default is that barbarian, and it's so easy for the campaign to move from one area to another, and the Ranger starts suffering terribly. The Ranger suffers terribly from being a combination of too generalized as a character class with their abilities, but at the same time, some of their strongest abilities or their core abilities are also super specific. So, horrible situation with that. Then we got onto the Rogue here. You got actually some really interesting options with the Rogue. You got two Rogue types that are off being more combat-y and more adventure-y, and you got two Rogue types that are more for like brainy type peoples. I've yet to see anyone ever use a Scout. I don't know why, but I have seen people use Swashbucklers. And then we have Sorcerers. All of them are good. Storm Sorcerer, everyone uses Divine Sorcerer, Storm Sorcerer, Shadow Sorcerer. They're all good. Warlocks, the king of the Warlocks is actually the Hexblade in here. The Divine or the Celestial Warlock is actually pretty decent still. And you also have a really nice selection of invocations. This is like the very first upgrade to the selection of invocations. And a lot of the options in this book are a lot better overall than, not a lot better than the PHB ones, but it does actually, like, it's sort of one of those situations where they, like, figured out what invocations work best on a warlock, and they bent everything towards making sure that the selection they had are really good options, or more refined. You have less dud invocations in this book than the PHB, but the PHB still has more. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, on the other hand, accidentally adds in some more dud invocations too. So there you go. And then you have the War Magic or War Mage. The War Mage is essentially, I want some really good defense on my wizard. I'm taking my... this is kind of like the Blade Singer wizard, but he forgot how to use a sword effectively, and he doubled down on defense. There you go. It's a decent class, but not amazing. And then you have this nice little section here on origins for constructing your character, like birthplace, heritage for tieflings, etc., etc., childhood home, childhood memories, acolyte, charlatan tables, a background table expansion for the original PHB. So you have a whole bunch of nice options right here. That's what happens when I have tons and tons of papers in my books, because they all just start falling out. You don't really know a D&D player until you see tons and tons of papers sticking out of their books. Because only real D&D players will have tons and tons of papers sticking out of their books because they bookmark stuff all the time. You happen to have racial feats, which is a concept that Wizards of the Coast moved towards and then went away from pretty quickly. I actually kind of like having racial feats. It's more specific to cultures. It adds another layer flavor to your character, and you don't necessarily have to use them. There are some really good ones in here, like Elven Accuracy, and Elven Accuracy is a great one. You have Orcish Fury, which is also another great one. You have Bountiful Luck, which is also another awesome one for halflings. You actually have some pretty good options in here. Then you happen to have the Dungeon Master's Tool section. Dungeon Master's Tool section actually clarifies a lot of information from the PHB and Dungeon Master's Guide. Sort of like, people have asked Jeremy Crawford enough questions about why something is this way, and he had to keep explaining that detail. So he went and had to... Wizards of the Coast staff went and had to clarify and put it all in this book, explaining in a little bit more detail what it is. There is also simultaneous effects information, falling, rate of falling, flying creatures and falling. Then you have a section on sleep, waking someone, sleeping in armor, going without a long rest. And then you have a section on adamantine weapons, tying knots, tool proficiencies. So it clarifies information on tool proficiencies. This also gives a summary on how to read this next section. Like on what's the benefit of using alchemist supplies? What benefits do you get from brewer supplies? What benefits from calligrapher's supplies? What benefits can you get from using carpenter's tools? Cartographer's tools, cobbler's tools, cook's utensils, disguise kits, foraging kit, glassblower's tours, herbalism kit, jeweler's tools, vehicles, leatherworker's tools, mason's tools, musical instruments, navigator's tools, painter's supplies, poisoner's tools, potter's tools, smith's tools, thieves' tools, tinker's tools, weaver's tools, and woodcarver's tools. Incidentally, I had to side note to this. They used this bold lettering here, which immediately jumps out to you. But in fact, up here, it actually starts up here. You see, they use a light tone text as the header, and then they put the exact word, the same thing, further down, right above the table, in bold lettering, and your eyes automatically go to that. And then we have a section on spellcasting to clarify all the little questions about spellcasting in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Like identifying spells, invalid spell targets, and stuff like that. But then they also have this nice little beautiful section right here. This is one of the reasons why you want to buy this book, because this effectively shows you how a spell is projected from your character. Such as, there's a standard triangle templates, then you have the box square, and they use dice as a means of showing how the character casts the spells. A line attack, a double wide here, a vertical one. This is a diagonal, and so forth. Then they explain encounter building techniques in more detail, or refine it. Please note that there's some contradictions in this book from the Dungeon Master's Guide. If it's something relevant to your players, mention it to them before the campaign starts. There's tables for monsters and versus character level. You got fight, flight, or question mark. You got new encounter tables for monsters for different environments. Right here. And it goes on pretty quick. It goes through many pages. Incidentally, I don't use any of these. I use custom ones that I based roughly off of them and updated to include newer books and third-party stuff. Then you have Traps Revisited section right here, which adds more clarification to traps and how they function, but they also add more traps on top of that, and designing simple traps and designing complex traps section. And working out yet again the lethality of traps, 2 levels, and the level you desire in their lethality. This is the complex trap section. Explains how complex traps work in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And examples of complex traps. Designing complex traps in more deeper detail. And so forth. And this goes on pretty quickly. And then you have a section on downtime. There's also a table in here on buying magic items, how to find them, the price rates, and stuff like that. Some people have homebrewed or updated this, like Luke from the DM's Lair actually has a really good table for this. You got a section on carousing, information on carousing, crafting a magic item, which is okay, but not the greatest. Really needs to be flushed out more. You got a section on crime, gambling, pit fighting, religious services, research outcomes, selling a magic item, training, and then you go into a section on awarding magic items. And then you also happen to have some common and uncommon magic items in here as well. These are actually pretty good add-ins to a low magic campaign as your first wave of magic items you give to your characters start getting. Because all these are actually pretty good for not breaking balance of the game, but also adding like flair to your characters, like the Cape of Billowing, or the Cloak of Billowing. Yeah, the Cloak of Billowing is in here. I got a player that currently has that in the campaign. These are really great. These are great for just adding so much flavor to your campaigns without breaking the campaign. I had to put that sheet back in because I use these all the time. These are like my first magic items that leak out to my players. Wand of Conducting. And then you have magic item tables that incorporates magic items in this book as well as the Dungeon Master's Guide. So they presume that you buy the Dungeon Master's Guide before this, and I would highly recommend that you do that. Then you happen to have the next Chapter 3, which is on spells. This is actually a pretty darn good section. You actually have some really good spells in here overall for both Dungeon Masters and players. Find Greater Steed. Paladins really love that once they get that, because that really unlocks a whole lot of options. I had a cleric who loved creating temples by summoning them up. You do it long enough, it stays there forever. In fact, my DM actually has now a problem that the post-campaign information that I gave for him, for my cleric, was that she now travels around the continent and creating temples to her god, and uses them as a means of aiding adventurers going out to do good deeds. So now there's this ever-expanding network that's of magical temples that is created by a halfling drunkard cleric that helps players out. So I'm thinking ahead for future campaigns on that one. Then you got a section on Appendix A on shared campaigns. This is actually a really neat section to read over. I have not read it completely through, but it's actually quite interesting of a section. Then you have Appendix B, which is on character names, how to randomly generate more random generation tables by race, age, and gender. And then some common human names in here. And then you got Celtic female names, Chinese male and female names, Egyptian names, English names for males and females, French names, German names, Greek, Indian, Japanese, Mesoamerican names, African names, Norse names, Polynesian names, Roman names, Slavic names, Spanish names. There you go. Alrighty. Now I'm going to go into this little section here and I'll explain this really quickly. This is an amazing book for Dungeon Masters and players. For players. Now, in the case of the Dungeon Master, I had to explain quickly. After buying, say, like a starter kit, a Dungeon Master guide, having the starter kit, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master Guide, and then you start collecting the monster books, like the Monster Manual, Morning Kingdom's Tome of Foes, etc. like that. This is like the 6th or 7th book you want to buy. This is actually a pretty good book overall. You want to at least get 1 or 2 monster books, so you have a nice variety. Definitely the Monster Manual before this and the Dungeon Master's Guide. But from there on, it's basically like you're filling out your stuff now. For the players, this is literally your book number 2. You get the Player's Handbook. Absolutely. And then you get this book. So there you go. From there out, I would say that this book is probably like a 3.75 4-star overall for both Dungeon Masters and players. Dungeon Masters have to kind of go through a whole bunch of stuff to get to really needing this book. But still, this is a very useful book for a broad range of options. And it also gives you some alternate options for players and Dungeon Masters alike. So there you go. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. And I hope you have a delightful day, a nice night, a wonderful week, and a magnificent month. And see you next time.